Hello viewers, welcome to this online session of lecture on the history of American literature. In this session, I shall discuss the meaning of Puritanism, the key concepts of Puritanism, the history of Puritanism in England, Puritanism under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the causes of conflict between the Anglicans and the Puritans, the circumstances which led to the settlement of Puritans in New England, and finally, the establishment of Puritan ideology in New England. So, what is Puritanism? Puritanism is a religious movement that began in 16th century to reform the Church of England. The religious principles are based chiefly on the concepts of free will, grace, and predestination. After the restoration of Charles II as the King of England in 1660, the Puritans were split into three denominations: the Presbyterian, Congregational, and Baptist sects. Now we will see the key concepts of Puritanism. First, predestination. It refers to the eternal decree of God. It is believed that God predestines the good to salvation, while the fate of the sinner often leads to damnation. God is also actively and directly involved in the affairs of nations and of individuals. Grace. The grace of the God is the rule of the Spirit in directing and governing the human will. To the Puritans, grace was gift from a kind and loving God. Covenants. They are the promises which God makes to human beings, and these are recorded in the Bible. The Puritans emphasized the covenant of works, which was under the human control, and the covenant of grace, which was in God's power to bestow. The covenant of works was God's promise to Adam. In return for perfect obedience, Adam would obtain God's reward. The other covenant was the covenant of redemption, glorification. It unites the human soul with God after death. Those who are elected will form a community of saints. Natural depravity. According to this concept, every human being is by nature corrupt and perverted as a result of Adam and Eve's fall. The human mind is so wicked, distorted, foul, and impure that it is deviated from the righteous path that leads to God. The human soul is fettered with wickedness and is thoroughly enveloped in sin. Regeneration. It refers to the converted individuals. Regeneration is the gift of God. Only God determines who should be saved in the fallen state. The glory emanates from God only. Human beings may think that they can reform at will and return to God, which is but a delusion. Sanctification. It is leading the life of a saint out of gratitude for God's grace. Vocation. It is God's call to social, economic, civil, and religious roles. Individuals must use their talents which they receive from God wholeheartedly in fulfilling their duties. However, they must not carry their behavior to extremes. Now we shall discuss who are the Puritans. Puritans were the dissenters and nonconformists who wanted to reform the doctrines and structures of the Church of England by eliminating every shred of Catholic remnants. Their theological conviction was based on the idea of God from the Old Testament. They emphasized on God's righteousness and control of the universe to achieve a just purpose. The Puritans sought a spirit of moral and religious earnestness. a direct personal religious experience and simple religious services. They opposed sensual indulgence, leisure, or celebration and considered those as sins. They believed man as infected, cursed, and sinful creatures ever since his fall from God's grace in the Garden of Eden. The Puritans were preoccupied with the concepts of sin and salvation. Therefore, religion dominated their lives and writings. Now we shall discuss the history of Puritanism in England. England was ruled by King Henry VIII from 1509 until his death in 1547. He and his queen, Catherine of Aragon, were both Roman Catholics. In 1527, King Henry VIII sought an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for the annulment, who however refused to do so for several practical reasons. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was the Holy Roman Emperor. Now this was one of the reasons why Pope Clement VII refused the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage. In 1534, King Henry VIII separated from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. King Henry VIII declared himself as the supreme governor of the Church of England. This was the initiation of English Protestant Reformation. King Henry VIII renounced papal authority of Rome. He seized considerable land and wealth of many monasteries. He appointed Thomas Cranmer as the Archbishop of Canterbury as the most senior cleric of England. This is the image of King Henry VIII. He ruled from 1509 to 1547. King Henry VIII, however, maintained a strong preference for traditional Catholic practices. After the death of the king, the Reformation movement was influenced by Protestant doctrines. It adopted the Calvinist interpretation that Christ was truly present in the Eucharist, but after a spiritual manner. It also believed that the Church of England should be restored to the purity of the first century church as established by Christ himself. Protestantism during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. King Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, ascended the throne in 1558, and by that time, Protestantism was the established religion. She tried to ease out the tensions between Catholicism and Protestantism, caused due to various religious changes initiated by Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I, who all of them ruled before her. In 1559, Elizabeth came up with religious settlement. She passed two laws, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Supremacy re-established the independence of Church of England from Rome and conferred on the Queen the title of the Supreme Governor of the Church. The Act of Uniformity sets out rules of religious practices and worship as in the Book of Common Prayer. This compromise retained some Catholic traditions besides maintaining the Protestant religious faith in England. The Protestant church established by Elizabeth in England came to be known as the Anglican Church. This is the image of Queen Elizabeth I, who was also known as the Virgin Queen. The Elizabethan settlement was generally accepted by majority of population. However, dissatisfaction brewed up among a minority of recusants who remained loyal to Catholics. The Puritans were the strict followers of Protestant principles, who thought that the Church of England was practicing different vices commonly attached to Roman Catholicism and therefore wanted to purge those. They tried to press religious reforms through Parliament. This conflict between the Puritans and the Church of England deepened as the latter refused to adopt the patterns of the Reformed churches of the continent prioritized by the Puritans. Condition of the Puritans in England. The reign of King James I began in 1603, and he introduced many reforms which the Puritans favored. By 1620, the Puritans were successful in transforming the Church of England according to their principles to a great extent. But startling reversals began to occur during the reign of King Charles I. King Charles I married the Catholic princess named Henrietta Maria to the utter dismay of the Puritans. Charles I also appointed William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. With the ascension of the King Charles I, the Archbishop Laud introduced several changes in English churches. These changes irked the Puritans since they considered those as Catholic in nature. When the Puritans began to complain against these reforms, Archbishop Laud had them arrested. Several persecutions were unleashed upon the Puritans. The dissenting clergies were hunted down, thrown into prison, whipped in the pillory, and were branded. This is the image of how the Puritans were persecuted by William Laud under the reign of King Charles I. Now we shall discuss the conflict between the Anglicans and the Puritans. The Puritans complained against the religious practices of the Anglicans. They believed that the Anglican Church was still continuing with the practices of Roman Catholicism. They opposed against the dress code of the ministers, use of ornaments, paintings and stained glass windows in churches, playing of music during services, ceremonial pageantry for services, elaborate decoration of altar, kneeling of people while taking communion, celebrations of saints' days. The Puritans also disapproved the power of the bishops. They suggested that church ministers should be elected by the people who attended church services only. The Anglicans, on the other hand, got the support of monarchy to maintain their episcopal system. They preferred to sustain the existing ceremonial pageantry for services like the use of elegant pomposity of attire for the priests, use of gold and colored glass during worship, and elaborate decoration of altar which began to be treated as a site possessing miraculous significance. The Anglicans also venerated the prayer book and the sacraments just as much the communion. The Puritans were appalled to witness these changes. They considered these changes as retrogressive tendencies within the church. They lay absolute emphasis on the Bible and believed that the Church of England was the driving force of the national life. The Anglicans pointed out that by law, the king and his officers of the Church of England were entitled to take all decisions in religious matters and insisted that everyone's duty was to obey them. The Puritans alleged that the Anglicans colluded with the Roman Catholic conspiracy and worked as the collaborators of the king and his followers to destroy Protestantism in England. The Anglicans laid stress on the second table, that is, the last six of the 10 commandments, whereby it was necessary to love fellow human beings, to be obedient and dutiful to appropriate worldly authority. The Puritans stressed on the first table, that is, on the first four of the 10 commandments, which ordered humanity to revere God, to glorify Him, and to hold Him as supremely important. They considered human beings have natural inclination to turn away from God. The Puritans were of the opinion that human beings choose evil knowingly. God's grace could be obtained only after painstaking, prayerful, and prolonged inner studies. God has sent Jesus Christ to save the fallen human beings. Therefore, it is necessary to do God's work on earth unceasingly in remaking and reviving this world. They hoped to erect a rejuvenated Jerusalem and not be deterred by existing tarnished edicts and customs. Now we will come to the New England Puritans. The consecrated cruelty against the diocese who showed religious dissent during the reign of King Charles I led many noblemen to immigrate to New England. The Puritans migrated to New England to practice their religious beliefs freely because back in England, in their own country, controls were placed on Puritan preaching. They wanted to escape the Catholics' persecutions and also the conflict with the Anglicans. In 1620, a group of separatists known as the Pilgrims settled in New England and established the Plymouth colony. In March 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company succeeded to obtain royal charter from King Charles to establish Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first great Puritan migration to the New England took place in 1630. The Puritans arrived in New England, boarded on the ship named Mayflower. They established their first settlement in Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is the image, an old image of the Mayflower voyage that started from England in 1630. This is the first image of the first Puritan settlements when they landed in New England. Now we shall discuss the Puritans' encounter with the native Indians. The English colonists brought various diseases that killed Native American tribes. With the early visits of English fishermen in 1616 to the New World, the European disease called bacilli came to the continent. The disease assumed epidemic proportion and killed nearly half of Indian population. The second disaster happened in the early 1630s after the arrival of the Puritans, when smallpox killed thousands of more Indians. The Puritans were insensitive to these tragic human disasters. They considered the deaths of the native people as God's wishes, as if the land was made empty for their arrival and stay. The Piquet War. The Piquet War was an armed conflict that took place between 1636 and 1638 in New England between the Piquet tribes and the Puritan colonists. In this war, about 700 Piquet tribes had been killed or taken into captivity. It brutally obliterated the natives, but this horrid destruction, in which many tribes were burnt alive and many were taken into captivity, was justified as God's will, and the violence was validated. The war resulted in the elimination of Piquet tribe, and the colonial authorities classified them as extinct. These are the images of Piquet War. Puritanism, the hegemonic American ideology. The Puritan migration obliterated the old cultures of the Native Americans. Historian Francis Jennings says, according to historian Francis Jennings, the so-called settlement of America was a resettlement, a reoccupation of a land made waste by the diseases and demoralization introduced by the newcomers. Under these conditions, Puritanism emerged as the hegemonic ideology of America. The ideological base was created through documentation of early experiences in the New World. These documentations were made from several Puritan narratives right from the beginning of the arrival of English colonists. New narratives were created where the Puritans justified their viewpoints. The Puritans recorded their everyday experience and struggles in the foreign shores and thereby created their own history. The native Indians, the African slaves, had no place in this history. They were mostly illiterate and they didn't thought to document their culture and history. Therefore, they were either written down or written out of the Puritan narratives. These historical narratives were written to preserve the Puritan interests, to justify their stories from Puritan viewpoint. John Winthrop. The sermon preached by John Winthrop, named A Model of Christian Charity, was one such early writings which helped to create ideological narratives of the Puritans. Winthrop led the Puritans in the Great Migration in 1630. He envisioned an ideal picture of Massachusetts colonists in covenant with God and with each other, who were divinely ordained to build New Jerusalem in New England. This is the image of John Winthrop. William Bradford. William Bradford documents the early history of Puritan life in his book of Plymouth Plantation. It was written between 1630 to 1651. The book describes the journey from England to New England and founding of Plymouth settlement. He discusses the struggles of the English colonists in the New World. He also talks about the health and spiritual welfare of the colonists. Bradford justifies the brutal killings of Piquet tribe due to Puritan raid as God's will. Bradford's book served as memoir of Puritan suffering during their early days of arrival. William Bradford's contribution. William Bradford intended his book to be read by future generations. It has served as memoir of the Puritan sufferings in their early days of arrival. It also narrates that how the Puritans have emerged as coherent community, braving all hardships in a foreign land infested with adversities. Bradford's chronicle is distinguished from early American texts by portraying the native tribals as adverse antagonists of the white Europeans. The book creates an impression of the New World as a wilderness inhabited by savage tribes. It was justified that America was made according to the Puritan wishes and had nothing to do with rest of Europe. This is the image of William Bradford. So let's sum up now. In this session, we have discussed what is Puritanism. What were the chief tenets of Puritanism? We also discussed the causes of conflict between the Puritans and the Anglicans, how their religious beliefs diverted from each other. Then we discussed the condition of Puritanism during the reign of Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I, and simultaneously during the reign of James I and Charles I. After that, we discussed the circumstances which led to the migration of the Puritans to the New World. And finally, we talked about the establishment of new Puritan ideology and the Protestant historiography in America by wiping out the indigenous culture, tribal culture of America. Thank you.